You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. Hi, everyone. This week, my guest is six-time New York Times bestselling author Joe Garner. Joe is one of the premier historians on media and pop culture. He has collaborated with news and entertainment icons like Walter Cronkite, Regis Philbin, Bob Costas, Dustin Hoffman, and many others. As you will hear in our conversation, Joe didn't start out with all the answers or a powerful network to help him get things done. Joe is scrappy, resourceful, and built a rolodex filled with industry titans simply because he is not afraid to ask for help. In 1998, Joe broke the mold in the publishing industry with a groundbreaking idea: write a book about history's most dramatic moments and integrate audio CDs, remember them, into the book so readers can listen to the original news broadcasts as they read. He cold called dozens of publishers about his idea and was turned down by all of them. Joe persisted and eventually linked up with a publisher who believed in the idea, but still had doubts it could be done. After all, Joe needed news networks to agree to let him use their audio in his book. Well, he pulled it off. He even wrote a cold letter to broadcasting icon Walter Cronkite asking him to write the book's foreword. And much to Joe's surprise, Cronkite responded and said yes. Joe's book, We Interrupt This Broadcast, has sold over 1 million copies and hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2 consecutive years. He has also written several other bestsellers, including And the Crowd Goes Wild, and the first ever authorized biography of NASCAR legend Jeff Gordon. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and I hope it helps you grow your own network and push big ideas forward. I think you are going to love this conversation. So let's pull the tarp and get straight to Joe Garner. You're one of the premier chroniclers of history and pop culture, but I want to start something unique that you do with your books. In many of your books, you have integrated audio with incredible photography and obviously wonderful writing. Where did the idea come from to integrate audio into your books? Before, people were talking about, audio books on Amazon and Kindle like they are now.
Yeah. Well, it all starts with the fact that I've had a lifelong love and passion for radio and television broadcast media and history and how the two intersected. I was working at Westwood One Radio Networks, and this would have been the late 90s, around 1997, 98. And I was in a meeting, and we were talking about programming to commemorate the passing of the 20th century into the 21st century. And I was struck by how everybody in that room had a story to tell. I mean, they were compelled to share, depending on how old they were, say the Kennedy assassination. They knew exactly where they were and what they were doing when that happened, or the Apollo 11 moon landing, or the freeway chase of O.J. Simpson, all of these landmark moments. And I got back to my desk and I started thinking about that. And I couldn't let it go. I thought, wow, these have become more than defining moments in history. They've become the benchmarks of our lives. They're shared moments, the where were you when moments. And then I thought the other common denominator of all of these events were that they were introduced to us with the same 4 chilling words: we interrupt this broadcast. And literally in that split second, that's when I had the idea for my first book. Up until that point, I'd had zero aspirations of being an author. But I've been a collector. I've got books of broadcast history here at my desk and so forth. So anyway, I just started thinking about that idea. And then it occurred to me that we live in such a wonderful age because our history is literally recorded. So I thought I could tell each of these stories in the text, illustrate them with the images that are inextricable with our memory of the event. And then I could add the actual broadcast audio and bring the history to life. And 90s technology being what it was, CDs easily tucked into an inside back cover of a book. And Andrew, it was just one of those turning point moments where you think, God, maybe I ought to do something with that idea someday, or maybe I ought to do something with that idea. And I opted for the latter. Didn't know anything about the publishing business. So I grabbed a book off my shelf, looked at the name of the publisher, and I cold called him. And I cold called the next one and the next one and the next one until I got blown out of every publishing house in New York City. And finally, a friend of mine said, look, I know this funky little publisher out of Naperville, Illinois, and this just might be something that they'd be interested in. So I met with her. And she said, I'm going to do this on one condition. And I said, what's that? And she said, that you agree to go out and promote it, because if you've just sold me, you'll sell the American people. And I thought, well, I come from broadcast. That'll be the easy part. So I spent the next 6-8 months putting the book together. And about 2 months before we went to press, I thought, I need a name on the cover of this book that really embodies the history of broadcast journalism. And at that time, Walter Cronkite was still alive. So I didn't know him, didn't know anybody who did. So I wrote him a letter explaining what I was hoping to accomplish with this mix of media and how his words should be the first in a book like this. And to my surprise, about 10 days later, I got a call from his chief of staff, Marlene Adler, saying Walter would be happy to write the foreword to the book. So we put his foreword with the book, put it out in October, and by December, it hit the New York Times bestsellers list, just changed the whole trajectory of my career. And adding that audio really did, my hunch was correct. It brought the history to life. And so then when I was trying to think of what to do next, sports just seemed to lend itself.
And that's when you do, and the crowd goes wild.
Yeah, I added the play-by-play. What I didn't know at the time was that it was going to be infinitely more difficult, because I went to my contact at ABC Sports because I had had to license Howard Cosell's announcement of the death of John Lennon for We Interrupt This Broadcast. Anybody that was alive at the time remembers that mostly for the way they heard it on Monday Night Football. So I went back to ABC, and her name is Louise. I said, Louise, I think I'm going to do a sports edition where I'm going to have the same format, tell the stories, great photographs, and the actual play-by-play. And she sat back and she said, I can't believe you're going to try this. And I said, what's the difference? She said, well, we own the newscast. We own Peter Jennings' voice. But when it comes to sports, the ownership is shared between the leagues and the networks. So before we can even begin to negotiate with you, you're going to have to be licensed or sanctioned by Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NBA, the National Hockey League. I see you have the Borg-McEnroe bout from the 1980 Wimbledon on your list, so the All England Lawn and Tennis Club is also going to have approval rights. And I just thought, go broke. So I said, well, if I can get all those rights, will you license me the audio? And she said, sure. So my next call was to the head of rights and clearances at CBS Sports. And she wouldn't take my call. So I kept calling at odd times, so to maybe catch her gatekeeper off guard. And I finally did. And she said to me, Joe, we would never participate in a project like this, nor will any of the other networks. And I said, well, if you'll give me 30 more seconds, let me tell you about my conversation with your colleague at ABC. And she did, and I did. And she said, we'll do whatever ABC does. So ABC, NBC, they all followed suit. And so I wound up putting out And the Crowd Goes Wild, which was a compilation of the greatest sports moments with the actual play-by-play. And again, I thought, I need somebody associated with this that's inextricable with, sports and sports broadcast. And Bob Costas was the first guy that came to my mind. And again, I didn't know Bob, and I didn't know anybody who did. So I wrote him a letter. And as luck would have it, he had received a copy of We Interrupt This Broadcast as a Christmas gift the year before. So he understood it. He had an affinity for it and agreed to do it. And we put out And the Crowd Goes Wild, and knock wood, that hit the New York Times bestsellers list and became so popular that it wound up bringing We Interrupt This Broadcast back on the list. So that year I got really lucky and had 2 on the list simultaneously. So I've had a ball, though. I mean, these have all been pinch me moments. I felt like a kid in a candy store doing all of these.
Joe, there's no question it is a great gift. And the Crowd Goes Wild sits on my dad's shelf. I recall many, many years ago, my brother and I got it. I think it was a Father's Day gift.
Oh, that's great.
It's a great book. As I hear your story, I mean, the 2 words that come to mind, there's a lot of words that come to mind thinking about your story. But Joe, 2 words that come to mind are persistence and resourcefulness. I think your story speaks to your, ability to persist through from a vision to executing that vision, and also to be quite resourceful, making contacts with people that you didn't know or didn't know anybody who knew, and trying to break down every barrier that you could. Are those traits that have always been a part of you?
They really have. I was very, very lucky to have grown up in a household where power of positive mental attitude was preached. I remember going for my first job at the local radio station and my dad pulling me aside and he said, "Now, Joe, I want you to close your eyes. And you've met Mr. Willie before. I want you to imagine what he looks like again. And imagine when you walk into his office and you grab his hand and you shake that hand. Imagine what that feels like." That whole visualization and preparedness, was instilled in us at a very early age. And, we weren't discouraged. I have a picture right above my head here of a very young me, 9 years old to be exact. I always had an ambition for the entertainment business. And growing up in the cornfields of central Illinois, I was about as far from the entertainment business as you could be. But every year, my father worked for Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. We would go to Milwaukee for the annual convention, and they always hired big name entertainment to entertain at these conventions. And that particular year, 1969, they had one of the biggest stars on the planet, Bob Hope, was entertaining for the convention. So somehow in my 9-year-old mind, I just thought if I could meet Bob Hope, that somehow my ambitions would be furthered. And you can only imagine how mortified my folks would have been thinking that I was now going to write to the president of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance to see if he would help me realize this goal. And they didn't. They let me write the letter. And to their surprise, I got a reply from Francis E. Ferguson was his name. He was the president and CEO of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance, and said, in short, I'd be happy to help you achieve your goal. And he made the arrangements before Bob walked out on that stage to stand there and to meet with me and to talk with me and so forth. So, I actually have photographic, sort of memorialized in a photograph, that moment that taught me so much, which is, if you put your mind to it, there's nothing that you can't go for and hopefully can't achieve.
Well, Joe, I think you make such a great point there, because one of the barriers to success, I truly believe, is sometimes just not asking, right? I mean,
it's fear.
If you don't ask, you don't receive. You have no chance of receiving something unless you ask.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that has carried me, to this day. I was doing a radio interview one time, and the host said to me, "What made you think you could get Bob Costas or Walter Cronkite or Dustin Hoffman to participate in your projects?" And I was like, I didn't stop to think that. It just, look, you can't just go off. You've got to prepare. You've got to do the work, and you've got to understand, how people, their affinities for certain projects and things like that. So, there is thought going into it, but it's like, why not ask them? Why not go for these names of these people to participate? That barriers, I guess, was sort of eliminated early on in my life, and I've just never allowed that to be a hurdle.
Joe, I'm reminded of a story when I was in college. I was putting together a fundraising event. It ended up becoming a very, very large fundraising event. We raised almost $100,000 the first year. We raised almost $300,000 the second year. And one of the people I networked with in town set me up a meeting with a phone call with the former chairman of Merrill Lynch.
Wow.
And she said, "I want you to ask this man to be one of the signature sponsors of the event." And she's dialing the speakerphone, and she says, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yeah, I did a little research." She said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yes." And he gets on the phone. He says, "Andrew, how can I help you?" And I said, "This is what we're doing." He says, "How can I help you?" I said, "Would you mind donating $10,000 to our cause?" This would have been, at the time, the biggest donation we had ever received for this program. Joe, I kid you not, less than a half a second, he says, "Andrew, who do I make the check out to?" So
That's great.
I'm dancing in my chair. We hang up the call. And the lady who had set up the phone call for me, she says, "What are you dancing for?" She says, "You asked for way too little." She says, "Do you know who this guy is?" She says, "Look him up. She says, this man had donated tens of millions of dollars to the university. He has no greater passion than this university. His name is on a couple of buildings. His name is on the honors college. Your ask was way too low, Andrew, but we'll try again next year. And while, of course, I was grateful for every dollar that he had contributed, it was the fact that I never even thought I could get to a table like that with this new fundraiser, ask someone, that prestigious a question, and him provide an answer to the affirmative. But I also realized that, maybe my ambitions were too low. And if you don't aim high, you don't go as high as you possibly can. I keep thinking about these stories and people who don't achieve things because of the fear that you described, because they're afraid to ask.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, that to me, that's the most common hurdle that people have to overcome. I love the line that I think it was Jim Carrey said in a commencement address, where he said, there are people out there that live their entire lives in fear disguised as practicality. And that's pretty profound and true and all too common. It's just always been, I've always looked at situations like that where I've had to do the ask. And what I try to put in the forefront of my mind is what it's going to feel like when they say yes. You know what I mean? And that's what then gets you on that phone and makes you dial that number or get on the Zoom and, or ask for the money. $10,000 seemed like a lot to you at that moment, and that's fine. Then you'll feel even that much more emboldened to ask for $100,000 the next time, or $1 million or whatever it is. So the other thing that I ascribe to too is the good Lord looks out for the ignorant and the persistent, and the trick is to be the right mix of both. Don't let inexperience or a seeming lack of knowledge, hold you back either. Sometimes you just have to dive in and figure it out, and you never want to be afraid to do that.
I think that's right. And I also think there's a piece of this that comes down to preparation too, and doing the work. And, you alluded to before some of these big asks that you made, you really familiarized yourself with those individuals and their careers and what their passions were. Talk about that for a minute. How do you kind of incorporate some of the research and information gathering when you're making a big ask like that?
Right. Well, using Bob as an example, I just knew that he's got an encyclopedic memory when it comes to sports. It's ridiculous. But I knew that he was a huge admirer of Red Barber, the first Dodger announcer, and the way that Red would weave a story and that kind of stuff. And so I knew that Bob had, like I said, an affinity for the history of sports broadcasting. Putting those two things together, the fact that, the subject of my book was going to be great moments in sports, but really an emphasis on the play-by-play, it was almost as if it would have been a surprise if he'd have said no. I'm not offering big checks either. So it's got to be something that they really feel a kinship with. And I think that was the same thing with, We Interrupt This Broadcast has now been adapted into a podcast series. And the podcast is narrated by Brian Williams. But again, it was an easy ask to go to Brian because of easy in the sense that I thought he would do it for the same reasons that, that Bob had an affinity for sports journalism or sports broadcasting. Brian is in the lineage of, Murrow and Cronkite and Dan Rather, those classic anchors. And he agreed to be a part of that right away. So it's like we've said, it's prepare. Don't go in half-cocked, know what you're talking about and be able to present it well, and you'll probably get lucky.
Joe, you've alluded to a few of them. You've collaborated with some of the greatest icons in entertainment and news. What have you learned from them, working with them, observing them, that you think has been some of the keys to their success?
Well, I can't say that I necessarily learned. What it reaffirmed was the idea that you got to put in the work. You got to, one of the scariest moments for me was when Bob and I were promoting, I believe it was in The Crowd Goes Wild, and we were asked to be on the Larry King Show. Well, suddenly I'm sitting right next to Bob Costas on Larry King. So I knew my game had to raise really high. And so I made sure that I really prepared and I spent the time and did the research so that I would be able to complement what he was saying, and we'd be able to complement each other that way. And the other thing I learned about Bob is, I knew when I wasn't going to be able to speak with him, especially if it was 2 or 3 months before the Olympics. I mean, he just immersed himself in the research and the story, the backstories, and all those sorts of things. So, it just reinforced that you really want to almost over prepare sometimes, because you don't want to have to be concerned about, am I prepared enough?
Joe, one thing that's always been clear to me is that the titans of any industry, the really successful people, the elite performers, do the work. And it's no different with you. It's no different with Bob Costas. I guess I'm curious to dig a little deeper into that. Are there little things that you do or you've observed others doing that seem like really little things on the surface, but make a big impact?
Whew, that's a good question. I don't know if this necessarily answers your question. You can wave me off if it doesn't. But I think one of the things that is really important to me is routine. My alarm goes off at 4:30 every morning. I do not hit the snooze. I don't allow myself to hit the snooze, and I have a routine that starts my day. And I think that puts me in the mindset. And I also make sure that the day before, I list the things that I hope to accomplish the following day. And I don't have a laundry list. I try to keep it to the most important things. And the other thing I try to do too is to not allow distractions. Just because somebody's calling doesn't necessarily mean I have to answer that phone. Just because somebody sent me an email doesn't necessarily mean I have to address that email at that moment. And I really do, in the schedule, I'll put down, from 6 a.m., like I have a standing call with a business partner at 6 a.m. every day. And so from 6 to 7, I know that time is for that. And then I'll look at the rest of the list and kind of allocate how much time I think it should take and really try to force myself to stay to that schedule. So it's about routine, about scheduling, and about not allowing for unnecessary distractions.
Joe, I'm curious, in addition to some of the work that we've already talked about, you wrote one of the authorized biographies on NASCAR legend Jeff Gordon. And I'm curious, when you're doing an authorized biography like that, and you're spending months upon months getting to know that individual, and then you have to essentially tell their story in your words, what is that experience like? And how does all that work?
Well, as Jeff told me in the very beginning, he said, this isn't going to be a tell-all book, but it'll be a tell-most. And it was an amazing experience. I loved every minute of it. And it was over a year that we worked together on that. And I saw parts of this country I never thought I'd see. Parts of Arkansas and, good Lord, North Carolina and, beautiful, wonderful places. And immersed myself in a world that I never thought I'd be a part of, which is NASCAR. But it was... at times what would happen is I would say to him, first of all, he had no memory whatsoever. And he'd be the first one to tell you that. He has no memory. So I would try and get stories from him. And then, he would sort of hint at who was involved in that story. Then I would go out to those people, get their version of the story. Then I would come back to Jeff and say, okay, this is what they told me. What do you think? So then I would write out a chapter and I would submit it to him to read. And sometimes he wouldn't get upset, but it's a little jarring, because you have your version of, how things transpired. But then when they actually have to be documented and you've got other people's opinions and versions of the story, sometimes it's hard to sort of reconcile. And all I kept saying to him was, Jeff, these are words on a page. I can erase them. I can backspace. I can change them. So don't get caught up in, how I present them at any given moment. We can always change them. But to his credit, there were things that were tough for him to address. His first divorce, for instance, his separation from his family for a while because of his first wife and these sorts of things. But so to relive those were difficult. But to his credit, knew that the story had to be told and there's only one truth and this is the way it looks.
I love that story, Joe, about your experiences working with NASCAR legend Jeff Gordon because of his willingness to maybe not tell all, but like you said, tell most. What do you think from your vantage point, spending a lot of time with him? What made someone like him so successful?
Everything that we've been talking about, the through theme of this entire conversation, it's about work ethic and preparedness. I never saw anything like it. And fortunately for him, his story really is almost a Disney-esque kind of story. But he, was very fortunate to have a stepfather who saw in him his talent. And his stepfather's almost worthy of a book in and of himself. His name's John Bickford. Anybody involved in NASCAR will know John Bickford. In fact, that was one of the greatest experiences I had when I first started working with Jeff, and I met John and Jeff at the track in Phoenix. And so I'm walking with John, and it was like being with the mayor of the city. I mean, everybody came up to him, and, so it was a great way to immerse myself immediately. But they would, like almost any good champion, they are all about being prepared. Friend of mine, sports writer for the LA Times, told me one time that he was interviewing Jack Nicklaus. And he was supposed to interview him right after he came off the golf course. And Nicklaus playing in for a championship or, some tournament. And he said, look, I'll still do the interview with you, but you got to come back out onto the course with me. He had to go back out there and play it again. I'm reminded when Jeff and I went to Bristol, Tennessee, to the track there, and he raced on that track dozens and dozens and dozens of times. But we put our stuff down in his motor coach, and he said, come on, Joe, let's go out and walk the track. And I was like, what? So we went out there, and we're literally walking on the racetrack. And then as we're talking, I'd see him get down on his hands and knees and run the palm of his hand on the pavement. He wanted to feel the pavement, feel if it's rough in certain places. Nothing replaces that. If you want to be really successful, you've got to really work hard at it, and you've really got to do the homework and be prepared. And that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's the common theme, and that was the theme with Jeff.
I'm like beaming with a smile here listening to that story because it's everything we talk about on this show every week, right? The little things add up to big things. And we've talked about a lot of it today, asking questions when you could have decided not to ask the question, reaching out to someone who maybe you didn't think was reachable. Jeff Gordon touching the pavement to feel, whatever he was looking for on that pavement. I mean, these are the little things that add up to big success. I guess where I want to wrap up, Joe, is really everything, it seems like, comes down to relationships and the power of connection. And you have this really, really fantastic ability to connect with people. Once you start a relationship, how do you go about continuing to, serve the people that serve you?
Wow, that's a good question. I'll confess, Andrew, that is one area that I really have to work at. For a long time, I felt sort of like a vagabond. I mean, I would immerse myself in, I did a book on Notre Dame football, for instance. So, I mean, I'd get to know everybody, the alumni director, the athletic director, the coach, the whole thing. And then I've got another project to do. So I'd pull up my stakes and I'd move to, motion pictures, or I'd move to comedy, or I'd move to, and I had to be mindful of the fact that these relationships were cultivated and these people helped, and you have to maintain that. You have to do what you can to keep those relationships together, as busy as you are trying to develop new relationships in another subject. So that's something that I really have to work at. Because you get busy and all that kind of stuff, sometimes you kind of go, I'll reach out to him next week, or I'll reach out to him in a month or two, or something like that. But, I mentioned John Bickford a moment ago. We did that biography back in 2015, but I spoke to him probably 2-3 weeks ago. So I do work at it. I do try to do it. And I do genuinely, sometimes miss these people, or, what have you. But, you get caught up in the new relationships you have to develop. But You can't forget about the past ones, especially because you never know when they're going to, when you're going to need to reach out to them again. And there's nothing more embarrassing than going, hey, I know we haven't talked in about 6 or 8 years, but I need a favor. I need something, that's just, we've all been in those conversations, but I hate those.
Joe, I have had so much fun. I could talk to you for hours upon hours. Joe, you are a tarp puller. There is no question. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with me this week.
My pleasure. Anytime, Andrew.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Instagram at AndrewMoses123 and sign up for my monthly email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.